Namaste and welcome to this lecture titled Repackaging Hinduism for Our Civilizational Survival. The Indic civilization or the dharma-based civilization has ancient Hori traditions as its basis. These traditions have acted as a provider of therapy for the human condition, which is defined by grief, senescence, and death. The dharmic traditions have constantly and fearlessly sought to alleviate these limitations of the human spirit and have demonstrated through various paths how liberation can be attained from them. Hence, the dharmic traditions of India are not merely parochial, they do not limit themselves only to the Indian, they are rather aimed at the whole of humanity. Therefore, when such traditions start to erode, when interests of worldwide imperialistic domination and neo-colonialism in its religious, political, or economic forms cause enormous epistemic and physical violence to these traditions and their upholders, we risk losing a most important legacy of humanity, and hence the need for a discussion on today's topic. As an academic platform, the Rashtam School of Public Leadership respects diverse points of view, and this is to provide a space for the uncomfortable truths that we might otherwise shy away from. Therefore, in line with our values of diversity and integrality, we try to understand the present issues that currently pose as a threat to the continuity of the dharmic or Indic civilization. To the audience, you can type your questions and comments in the comment box below the video, and we will try to take up as many of them as we can, if time permits, after this lecture for a Q&A and discussion session. Let me tell you about our speaker today. Debabrata, who's our speaker today, has been interested in history and politics since his childhood days. In his high school years, the Ram Janmabhoomi movement led him to the discovery of the Hindu roots of our civilization and to explore the philosophical as well as esoteric dimensions of Yoga and Tantra. Over to you now, Debabrata.
Thank you, Sridhar, for having me. And thank you and welcome to everyone, every participant, every viewer, listener here. I understand this is a Saturday afternoon. You might be spending some time. Thank you for spending the time here. And if you're living in an area where you're having lockdown, I hope the next 1.5 hours would be well spent. So coming to the topic itself, the repackaging Hinduism for civilizational survival. It has, basically, if you look at it, it has two parts. One is the repackaging of the Hinduism and talking about the civilizational survival. That also brings us to the question about what is the role of a religion in our civilization, how religion influences civilization. For that, we can take a look in the next slide, where we have the quote from Emil Cioran, who was from Romania, a Romanian-born philosopher. So he made a very profound observation that a civilization is destroyed only when its gods are destroyed. Now, it's something that we can see is attested by history. Like if you look at the map, the Hellenistic world, the Persia, all the civilizations, the people exist. But they are not the civilizations, the present civilizations in this places is not the same as the old civilization. The reason is that there is a lack of continuity. And that continuity has the discontinuity and that snapping of the ties with the past, with their ancestors has happened only because the ancient religions were destroyed. So we can understand, on the other hand, if you look at the right-hand side, the Indic civilization, the Chinese civilization, the Japanese, we are still the same old people and the same old civilization with the same old, I'll say, historical memory there. So which also shows that religion is one of the key factors, one of the key drivers of civilization. And it's not just civilization, it's in fact, religion is one of the most fundamental and the most important component of our ethnic identity, of our national identity, and also because of these two, naturally, it's also of a civilizational identity. So we can say definitely, if the we can move on to the next part, the next slide, where where from this we can draw a corollary that religion makes a civilization worth defending. Because if religion influences, has such a profound influence on a civilization, on culture, then if you want to save that culture, that means that if that there is some greatness about that culture, about that civilization, religion had definitely had a role to play. So it makes a civilization worth defending, right? But the question is, does religion also help in defending a civilization? Because we are talking about repackaging Hinduism for civilizational survival. So we understand that if civilization, if the religion is making our civilization worth defending, now the question is, can it also help in defending? For that, we can move on to the next, where we need to understand the role of religion in politics, because a nation's and a civilization's survival means the survival of the people, their political sovereignty, etc. So what does the religion have a role? What kind of a role does religion have to play in this juncture, in this kind of a scenario? So if you look at it, there are two very fundamental observations of politics. One is that it's downstream from culture, and the other is that demography is destiny. Now, the politics is downstream from culture was said by Andrew Breitbart, was a leading right-wing thinker in the US. We have the Breitbart also news media from him. So there, if we can say definitely that politics, is it true or not? Yes, because the political structures that we have, whether it's democracy or it's a dictatorship, whether it's a secular or it's at least relatively liberal, or is it theocratic, this is largely determined by the culture itself, right? Like India is, you look at it, the West Asian world, where it's mostly dictatorship and monarchy, whereas in India, which is more pluralistic culture, you have a democracy, and so is in the Western Europe. Somewhere Eastern Europe is somewhere in the middle, it's a little more conservative. So we see a lot of somewhere moving between democracy and maybe a kind of a quasi-democracy, we can call that. So, but culture, again, as we just discussed, culture is also influenced by religion. So when we look at the West Asia again, so West Asian nations which have a lot of dictatorship as well as monarchy, then you see also the religion also has a major role to play over there. Western Europe and the US, Canada, for example, the Western, the liberal world, there the religion has taken a very different shape. Rather, the religion, the influence of a religion or the lack of influence of a religion, both have a role to play in the culture. In their case, in the Western world, means in the Western Europe and the US, Canada, it is the lack of the influence of religion, which also has gone through a certain historical process. Why there is a lack of influence, that has a role to play. Whereas on the eastern side, the Orthodox Church, that also has a role to play behind the culture, which actually manifests in their political climate. So there we see that religion is also influencing politics. But there is also another side, which is that when we say that the religion is influencing a nation's politics, we are actually referring to the demography, that what is the majority of that people, the population who are following, what religion are they adhering to. So there we have a kind of religion here in India, which is Hinduism, and West Asia, it's Islam, and Western Europe, it's more of a liberal Christianity, you can call that. And it's, again, going through that process. In the Eastern Europe, you have an Orthodox thing. But if you look at it, the dominance of a particular group may not always last long. And we have seen that. Like, Europe was not a Christian for all time. it was pagan, and that's why we have seen that civilization has now got decimated. So religion, how is religion also is changing demography? It's not just the demography that is deciding what is the majority's religion, but religion also has a role to play in changing the demography through evangelism, through conversion, through proselytization. So this is how religion is playing a role in civilization, in nation building, in civilization building as well, and also in deciding their fate. So there, and now if you look at that, we can just now get into the point of repackaging. So we see that religion has a role to play in the civilizational part. Now we can see that what is, when we're talking about repackaging Hinduism, what we are referring to as repackaging. This is primarily, it is not, we are not talking about reformation here. We have seen the reformation that have happened in the 19th century. There were primarily three reformations, with the Brahma Samaj, with the Arya Samaj, and there was also one which is less known then, but one stream of the Gaudiya stream, which was largely influenced by this monotheistic creeds, and that is the Hare Krishna movement, which manifested in the next century as ISKCON. So these are the three major, we can say the three major reform movements. We are not talking about the Reformation here. We are primarily speaking about reformulation and restructuring. Reformulation is focusing on the theoretical aspects. So it's the tenets, that how you want to present the tenets to the people, to the society in general. And restructuring is the practical part, which is on the ritualistic aspects and also the various religious events that we can think of. So now the question is, why do we need such kind of reformation and restructuring? Why did not we think of something else? So what is reformulation and restructuring going to do us? They'll help us. It's just so in the next slide, and maybe even the next. So here we see, first of all, let us compare. We are also talking about the civilizational, the survival of it. And survival again means that politically remaining empowered, not to be disenfranchised. And we have also seen that how the religion can change the demography, as well as it can change the power structure, the power equations. Now, what is happening here? If you look at the Abrahamic cycle, like if entire history, we see that the Abrahamic forces have been on the rise, on the ascendancy for the last 2000 years. The pagan Europe got defeated, Africa got defeated, parts of Asia, the western parts of Asia got defeated, parts of Southeast Asia also got defeated. Now we are left with only parts of Asia, nothing else. Even the Latin America has also gone a long time back, and so is North America. So we can understand that how these things are happening on the other side. So in the Abrahamic part, what we see is the things start, the very first step is the ethno-religious education that is given to its subscribers since a young age. Now, what do we mean by the ethno-religious education? It's something like, first of all, everyone is aware of the theological framework, what it is, what are the basic tenets, the most fundamental tenets, the do's and the don'ts, etc. They also are very well aware of the history of their religion. It's not just the religion, but also the people of that religion, how it all started, how it spread out. That history is also taught. And the third thing is also they get to, since it is more expansionist in nature, there is always a natural tendency to understand the other. So there is also a kind of at least some kind of a study of the theological beliefs and ethics of other religions as well. So this ethno-religious education that is provided through the religious congregations, through the seminaries, through the institutions, and of course, very importantly, by the community and the family. I had some personal experiences also. Even a 5-6-year-old kid, a minority kid, he could actually figure out how many means that consciousness comes in, that how many people belong to his group in a grade, in something like in the first grade or the second grade. Now, that is the kind of consciousness, that awareness that comes in since childhood. Now, as the training goes on, as the indoctrination process goes on, what we see is now that there is a kind of that the global conquest is, of course, there, because the monotheistic creeds, the proselytizing creeds, I would say, they have the agenda of bringing their message to the entire world, to the entire humanity. So that agenda for the global conquest is also there. And of course, now why should we conquer the world? Naturally, only when we have a very sense of superiority. So that supremacist worldview also comes in. If you look at the the accounts, the medieval accounts of the European travelers who are visiting Asia, a very interesting thing to note is that even though Asia was far more prosperous, whether it's India and other places, they were far more prosperous than Europe, but you don't see that streak of that inferiority complex in their accounts. Rather, they are still feeling more superior because they belong to the right, the true religion, or they are worshippers of the true God. So, with that consciousness, what comes in is the activism. And that activism spreads out in different fields. One is that, of course, evangelism, convert people, bring them more to us. The other is the demographic aggression, which is something that it's consciously also done in some cases, that you have a higher growth rate. And of course, the general thing that we think of as the political, socio-cultural, and the academic activism. And academic activism is something that has become more important in recent times, especially in the times of the post-colonial times. The step four, once we have all those things, so the next natural, the consequent step would be to infiltrate the institutions, to make them, to influence them more, to arm towards them, to come up with laws, rules, regulations that is going to serve their agendas. And also, if it's a democracy, then you also get the demographic dividend to have more of your lawmakers from your community, and slowly you increase that numbers to finally get power. So this is what we can call the Abrahamic cycle of power and control. Now let's see the Hindu scenario. What is happening here? Right. So there we see, instead of coming to power, we are actually getting more and more disenfranchised. How is it? Starting from the step one, compared to their ethno-religious education, what we have is a very informal religious education. An informal in terms of family, uh, it's just like going to the temple, prostrating before the deity without any intellectual content, without any philosophical foundation. Then TV programs, we have some kind from Ramayana, Mahabharata, or any kind of the Puranic serials. And of course, the comics, notable among them is Amar Chitra Katha. So these are the ways that a Hindu child actually develops whatever he develops, whatever religious awareness that he develops. And of course, and at the same time, he knows nothing about the other. So when he grows up, what happens is that there is no intellectual or the philosophical foundation behind it, and from which we also get this idea that Hinduism is a way of life, as if Islam and Christianity is not. Even though we see that their ways of life, the people's ways of life of different communities are different, in spite of that, we cling to this idea that it is Hinduism that is a way of life, it's not a religion. That is one coming because of that lack of philosophical foundation. The other is that since the sense of differentiation is not there, we think that just like us, all religions are the same. It's just we are worshipping tens of deities, maybe just some other communities are worshipping something else. And there is a oneness, so all religions are the same. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam actually reminds me of a very important article. I think it came in 3 parts. That the hoax of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. I can't recollect the name, but that's a very interesting article. If you haven't read it, you can, I think, Google it. The hoax of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And of course, that since we think of religion as something very separate from any other secular pursuits, we feel that religion should be kept, or rather politics should be kept aside from religion, and vice versa. Now this things now leads to two kinds of activism. One who are more religious, they get into seva, some kind of a charitable institutions, doing something for the orphans, doing something for the girls, and some other also, like various many kinds of seva projects are there. But those who somehow get inclined into politics little bit, they think that electoral, at least in India, I'm talking about, since we're talking about the Hindus here, electoral politics is the be all and end all of everything. So we tend to outsource all our problems, all our miseries, all our anxieties, everything, aspirations, everything to some political parties. So we think that, okay, through elections, by making one or two on this or the other political party win the election, I think we can redeem ourselves and our situation. Those who look through it and see that this is not going to give us the dividend in the long run, they try to do some kind of political mobilization. But again, the problem is they're mostly myopic without any long-term roadmap. So they remain in the fringe, they do not become mainstream. So with this scenario, what happens is our power, our political hold, or rather our hold on the political apparatus keeps diminishing day by day. So this is what is the Hindu scenario. Now, if we just, so what is happening, we have already discussed that average Hindu is the average Hindu that is there. In the next slide, we shall see that he shows two kinds of characteristics. One, that he doesn't know, or he is not in a position to define or explain what Hinduism is. Second, since he doesn't know anything about his own religion, almost nothing, he is also not interested, or he's never taken interest in knowing someone else's religion as well. So these are some of the cases that, like with the NRIs, when the Hindus immigrate to the US, you find that when they're asked about Hinduism, they're at a loss. They don't know how to define it. Whereas even in India, there was a study done in the Daryaganj area, which has a mixed population, where while the Muslim kids could actually explain well about the Hindu pantheon and other things, the Hindu kids knew almost nothing about the Prophet's life or anything, or even some other insignia that the Muslims carry. So this is a very typical average Hindu situation, and which is something very dangerous. If you remember Sun Tzu's Art of War warning, that if you know neither the enemy nor yourself, will succumb in every battle. Now, this is the state of things. But what should be the ideal Hindu state? We can take a look at what Swami Vivekananda said. Now, this is from the Common Basis of Hinduism, a speech that he gave at Lahore. This is, I think, one of the three speeches he gave there. So there he said that, mark me, then and then alone you're a Hindu, when the very name sends through you a galvanic shock of strength. Then and then alone you're a Hindu, when every man who bears the name from any country, that's interesting. He's not confining it to India alone, but from any country, speaking our language or any other language, again, language is not an issue with him, becomes at once the nearest and dearest to you. Then and then alone you're a Hindu, when the distress of anyone bearing name comes to your heart and makes you feel as if your own son were in distress. A very important part of this, the Hindu identity, the way he tries to define Hinduism, is that a person is a Hindu only when he identifies himself as a Hindu, and he also identifies himself with the entire Hindu community. That is what he is actually saying. The first thing is, you can really be very proud, that pride thing, that okay, I am a Hindu, that saying that with pride, that can come only with an ethno-religious education. Because think of a scenario, if we can be proud of someone like Sunil Gavaskar, like an Indian. We can be very proud of Sunil Gavaskar because of all his achievements. But maybe three, four generations down the lane, Indians might not be knowing much. The younger kids might not be knowing much about Sunil Gavaskar. Can he have that kind of a pride for him? So the pride itself is dependent on knowledge, and knowledge itself, in case of the religion, that knowledge can come only from a proper formal education, and which is an ethno-religious education, because we also need to know the history. Pride comes from history, understanding the past. That is one. The second thing is, then the second part, he also speaks of the community sense, which can be, of course, from the education that we receive, but there has to be some kind of interaction with the community as well, so that there is a sense of oneness, which requires some kind of congregations and assemblies that we find in the monotheistic religions. Whether it's on a Sunday or a Friday or any other day, we need some kind of a congregations there as well. So this is what the scenario is. Now the question is, why is that education missing? So which we will see that we have seen that the education starts with primarily three, four things that we have noted, which is that the community and the family, the places of worship, the institutions of the religious institutions and the institutes, the research institutes. So here we find that, first of all, since it becomes a cycle basically, if I'm not aware of my religion, naturally I won't be able to teach much to my kids about my religion. So that is one, there is no education parted from the family or the community. The second thing is, in the temples, there are no congregations where intellectual inputs are given. Yes, there are some discourses, but these discourses are so much far removed, so far divorced from the real life and our daily problems. It's like taking us to some other world. It's not really confined, it's not related to what we are doing as a nation, as a society, as a community. That is there. Research institutions, again, their reach is extremely limited because of the first two problems. That is there. And the fourth thing is, and a very important thing is, that these days we usually visit, at least we are still connected with some ashrams or monastic organizations and others. But over there also the teachings, which is something very similar to what we see with the temples, it is primarily with some text which is dealing with the moksha and liberation. There is hardly any talk about other things like artha and akama, which is the part of the purusharthas as well. So this is the scenario, and these are the reasons why we are not having this, what do you call that, the ethno-religious education. Right. Now we can just look at it, that what has evolved actually to bring about this state of things, which we see in the next slide, which is that we can take a look at it in the different phases. Before the Islamic conquest, we see that since the times of the Vedic times, and personally I subscribe to the views of Shishikant Talagiri, that when the reference was about the Aryans, it is primarily with the Vedic Puru tribe, and then it slowly expanded. So when we talk about that expansion itself, that is also kind of an organic growth. So and that organic growth was primarily by, I would say, the growth was in terms of two ways. One is the Sanskritization of the culture outside, in terms of coming up with a social system, which is the Varnashram dharma, coming up with the Varnas. The second part of the Sanskritization was that all the local deities at different points, at different regions, they were also adopted and brought into the classical Hinduism. Most of it, if you look at it, many of the deities, especially the Shakta deities, they were actually adopted and accommodated within the pantheon slowly, and that has happened. So this is something very unlike the monotheistic religions, where it was imposed onto the people through political conquest. That is one. Second thing is that because of the unique geography of India, covered on the east, on the north, there is the Himalayas acting as a boundary, and then to the south and the east and the west, the sea is acting as a boundary. So we did not need to go for an expansion there. That is one was the natural, I would say, the barriers were there, but there was also another reason, which is that the land was extremely fertile. Now these days, when we see that when you hear that we did not conquer other nations, it gives an idea that we are very peaceful people, very passive, peacenik kind of thing. But which is not the case. The kings had been warring with each other through various kingdoms. We have seen that. The basic reason for non-expansionist ideal was that we had nothing to gain. Why should we cross the Hindu Kush to come up with the less fertile lands of Iran, except probably that the Mesopotamian region? But going to the deserts, what is there for us, right? And of course, then there was the Tibet in the north. South, of course, we did go to the Indonesia, and there, of course, we did set up some kind of an at least a cultural and a political empire there. So it's not that we never went outside, we did, but it was more of a cultural expansion. And then there is also then the social construction. This, so when we are not moving out, when we are living within, what happens is our own, because no society is perfectly homogeneous, it's always heterogeneous. So the smaller identities become more important. For example, if you look at, let's take the cricket for example. The cricket is also a great unifier for us. Even those where the secessionist uh, feelings might be strong, at least during the cricket matches, people find at least they find it very emotive to cheer for their countries and all. So there, if you look at it, like in this cricket when we are playing outside, it acts as a great unifier. Whereas if we did not play outside with other countries, then we would have probably ended up with just a Ranji Trophy. Now, if we played only with the Ranji Trophy, or like we see with the IPL thing, what would have happened? Only the regional identities, these things would have become more dominant. And this is what was actually happening as well, that we focused more on the jati sampradayas. This kind of identities became more important. And of course, because of the spiritual thing, there was also a focus on coming up with a social construction which is meant more for our progressive development, progressive spiritual development. This was fine till the Islam came in. And of course, before also there have been some invasions from the Huns, the Greeks, the Shakars, and all. But that was primarily restricted to the northwestern region, and the people were soon assimilated. With the coming of Islam, with the invasion of Islam, we found that there was no assimilation, number one, and the even the people, the what was felt earlier was at the elite level the changes. Now the changes was also felt at the at the local level, at the bottom level as well, at the local level. So people also, the even the Hindus, the common masses, they also started developing a sense of us and them. And that is how that Hindu identity also developed. But still, it was the identity was very much amorphous because it was not properly defined. But at the same time, there was also a greater rigidity in the social stratification, partly and largely because, again, because of lack of expansion. Not only just outside the country, because if you look at it, we had been trading outside, but as the West Asia became Islamic, as the Southeast Asia became Islamic, the problem with our businessmen is retaining their religion when they return. That was not happening. So naturally, the movement outside stopped. That is one. Second thing is, with the Muslim conquest, the Muslim powers were concentrated in the cities. So the people were also not willing to move out of their villages to the towns and other places. So that kind of a localization brought about a greater rigidity in the society. Thus far is okay, but at the same time, I would add that whatever the caste system, etc., had, it did help us in saving, at least during that period of time, in dealing uh, with Islam and the Islamic rule. I need not get into the details here, but it did help at that point of time. But that advantage was lost in the 19th century when we came up with some major changes. The reaction to those changes were some iconoclastic reforms, as I discussed earlier, also with the Brahmoism, with the Arya Samaj, etc. And finally, we moved on to the political mobilization, which was the Sangathan. and the advent of the RSS and the Sangh Parivar. I'll just explain the last two parts a little bit in detail here. So the 19th century, we see that the disruptive changes came up in form of the four major changes. One was the English Education Act of 1835, which brought in the British education system and removed the traditional education system. So, which actually forced the Brahmin community, at least much of it, to move out of their traditional profession or their traditional learning, whatever they're continuing with. And this is something very important because the Brahmins had always been the moral custodians of the Hindu society. When they were not in a position, so things actually started changing. That is one. The second thing is that higher education, the education also, we see from the Dharampal's books, The Beautiful Tree, that though the literacy rate was high, the study of the advanced studies were also very much, delineated according to caste. Like the philosophies, the Hindu philosophies, etc., were not learned by studied by everyone. But whereas with the printing press and the universal access to higher education, this barrier was broken. So everyone now could study the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Puranas, everything. And because of the opening up, at the same time, because of the availability of this text in the form of printed books. This is again a very major change. The third thing is, till the medieval age, today we may say that Hinduism is not history centric, but that is not how we view it till the 18th century. At least because that time the basic understanding was that they were the four yugas and everything. But this is the time also because of the Western culture, then the period of enlightenment, their ideas, and of course the Christian attacks. We also started to question some of our beliefs, our religious beliefs, and also the way we lived, the social systems, etc. The fourth thing is the Industrial Revolution, which is urbanization. In the villages, you might be seeing, those who are aware of, that usually there are ghettos of different community groups in the villages. But this is where there is again, we also discussed that the movement was lacking. Industrial Revolution brought in that movement here, that people were started moving out of the villages much and getting into the urban areas with the new factories, and also people, the new vocations were coming up, and people from all different castes, they were also joining in. So what was happening is the caste system, or the jati vyavastha, whatever we may call it, so that has actually helped us a lot till the Middle Ages in retaining our identity and also to defend us culturally, socially against the Islamic conquest, and during that period. But these advantages, we were losing these advantages during the 19th century. So that led us to the first and the earliest of response, which was in the Brahmo Samaj. Now it is interesting to note what Ram Mohan Roy said, that I regret to say that the present system of religion adhered to by the Hindus is not well calculated to promote their political interest. And I think it's necessary that some change should take place in their religion, at least for the sake of political advantage and social comfort. So that rationale, that to ensure that political advantage and social comfort, that was the driving force for him to bring about, to create the Brahma Sama or the Brahma Samaj, which turned it into a Brahma Samaj, which in turn actually took it forward. It definitely brought about some change in the mindset, in the outlook of its people. That from the jati-based worldview, it brought about a jati transcending a pan-Hindu, a modern pan-Hindu nationalist outlook, we may call it, which also led to a strong resistance to Christian evangelism in West Bengal, at least in Bengal, rather not West Bengal, in Bengal, and to some extent also in some other areas where some of the offices were formed, like in Mangalore, for example. That Mangalore, the Arya Samaj, the Rama Samaj, they had a major role to play also at the beginning in the last century, which actually now resulted in a very strong a bastion of the Sangh Parivar now. That is there. And of course, it laid the foundation for the Hindu nationalist narrative, uh, through the Hindu Mela, which started sometime in around 1860s. Uh, uh, this thing. And of course, it was later on taken over by Bankim Chandra and others, and Swami Vivekananda as well. Along with this, there was another movement that came up, which is the Arya Samaj, that we'll see in the next slide. So Arya Samaj, Swami Dayanandaji, Maharishi Dayanandaji came up also. He went beyond that. It was far more aggressive and far more rigid as well. Far more, the doctrines were much more clearly set in. He also promoted the idea of Swarajya and the Vedic polity, which are discussed. The Vedic polity has been discussed in detail in the sixth chapter of Satyartha Prakash. And then there was also the Shuddhi program that till then, at least till the Brahma Samaj and till the Arya Samaj, if someone had moved out of the Hindu fold, there was hardly any way, at least there was no formal way of bringing him back. But this is where the Shuddhi movement started. So we also started the reverse trend. And also came the Sangathan, which is the Sangathan movement also came in. This is something at around 1910-15 in the first half of before the RSS came in. That is how it started with the northern parts of India. And then in 1925, the RSS was born. It took up the Sangathan as its Mool Mantra. Shakas were the means of doing that. And then it came up with the Sangh Parivar just to spread its wings across all the spheres of life. Right. However, what is happening is in the 21st century, that we see in the next slide, that we see some kind of a problem that the Sangh experiment seems to have failed because of certain changes. The social, primarily social, because the consumerism has set in. People have become more careerist and less about interested in nation building and all that. And second thing is also that small families. Earlier, what happened till the 50s and 60s, used to have many siblings. So naturally, the parents would send their kids to the shakha. They would know that actually they would be growing up well, getting some guidance, get some good sanskars. 80s onwards, people were just having one or two at the most, focusing more on them, enough time, and there was also enough of kind of entertainment. They did not have to go to the school, to a shakha, to actually get all those learnings. This things were happening, as well as I would say that the politicization also created some problem, because a middle class family, and especially in an urban middle class family, would not like to send its child to an RSS shakha, knowing that this is probably something to do with the BJP and all that. So by the time of the end of the last century, around, from my experience, I've seen by 1990s, the shakhas were actually depleting in the urban areas, and so we find that presently, though the shakhas have increased, the overall volunteers have decreased, and the human resource quality has also diminished to a great scale. So to sum up the present situation now, so what you see in the next slide is just a simple thing. So what we have as a threats and the challenges to our survival: monotheistic ideologies, they have existed and they still exist. The academia, because of the Nehruvian secular thing, the academia, the media, and the constitution is not a threat, but it's more of a challenge. It creates a lot of hurdles also in our path, in making certain, at least safeguardings of our interest. But the academia, media, they are now largely controlled by the leftists. So again, we are facing a problem there. From the internal problems, pure internal problems would be the social cohesion, because we still haven't come across the caste system doesn't exist very strongly now. But the problem is that it has also not been replaced with something else which would bring about some kind of a cohesion. The temple community doesn't exist. The temples, that we have discussed that already. The ethno-religious education is missing, and an integrated dharma in the sense that it is still focusing only on moksha and not the other aspects, which is the artha and the kama, and of course the dharma part. So this is where things stand now. The question is now, how can we change them, right? So how can we realize them? So if we move on to the next slide, so here we see that the meeting the 21st century challenges here. Let's follow that same circle, how we can make the things change. First thing is that ethno-religious education, proper, through the temples, through the monasteries, through the research institutes and the community and the family. But that education can come in, the proper education, because even a person who might have studied 20 years in a Vedic Pathshala might still not have that sense of identity as a Hindu or some knowledge of the other. So we need a reformulation of the Hindu tenets, as well as the restructuring of the Hindu practices within the secular religious education that can bring about a change in our awareness, in our consciousness, in the national stage, at a national politics, bringing into focus that yes, the Sanatan Dharma, that is nationalism, which is just a quote from Uttarpada speech of Sri Aurobindo. And of course, that the Krinvanto, we also need to develop that expansionist attitude, at least the cultural expansionist attitude, keeping that the Krinvanto Vishwamaryam, which is there in the Vedas and which was also taken up by the Maharshi. So this, if we have this, we can now develop that kind of a proper activism in the different fields. We can also focus on family building so that this, again, the next generation keeps receiving that kind of an education. And the propagation. Propagation is also, I won't say that evangelism, but we can definitely propagate, and especially to the world at large. And that can, at least within the country, we can ensure that institutions are more pro-Hindu. And if we build the family, we focus on the family, the fertility rate that has been dropping drastically, especially within the educated class, that can also be checked and probably reversed. We can also start collecting the demographic dividend there. Now, before we get into this, the reformation and restructuring, how we can do this, we can take a quick look at the Balinese experiment. Right. So Balinese, many of you would be aware of that Bali is a part of Indonesia, but is also a Hindu majority. Now, and the Balinese Hindus, unlike us, they have not been colonized much, at least culturally or psychologically, they have not been much colonized. Though the Dutch, there was a Dutch control for some period of time, followed by the Japanese during the Second World War. In fact, the Japanese, interestingly, they tried to, when they saw the Balinese religion, they tried to label it as a variant of the Shinto Dharma, which shows that the Japanese were very much aware that how religion can be a very important tool for colonization as well. So what happened is during the 50s, when Indonesia got freedom, it came up with the Panchashila, the 5 principles, out of which the first and foremost one was that a belief in one and only God, which also meant that every Indonesian during the census and etc., they had to identify with one of the religions that were recognized by Indonesia, and that recognition depended on that religion believing in a one and only God. So there were primarily 3 religions, which is Islam, and 2 denominations of Christianity, which is the Catholicism and the Protestants. The Balinese Hindus were in grave danger of losing their identity. So what they did is they tried to actually persuade and the establishment into accepting that Balinese Hinduism also met the conditions that they had set, which means that basically a kind of apparent Abrahamization of Hinduism, but actually it is not. It was a very superficial changes, but a very profound one also, and something that we can learn from. First and foremost was the finding the common basis. For example, they came up with the 5 principles, which is that the first is there is one and almighty God, there is the Atma or the Jiva Atma, also the doctrine of karma was there, the reincarnation, and of course the liberation or the moksha. So they just restricted to this five common principles they all believed in. They also brought out some changes, and these were imposed from the top, but keeping everything else same. It's not that the other gods were just, the pluralism was lost. No, it is just that one particular thing was there. At the same time, there was also the collective rituals. They come up with the three sandha, which is something similar to, but kind of, at least I would say that inspired by the sandhya that is done here in India, and also a pancha sambha. It's a five-stage puja. You can say, starting with the deha shuddhi and with a namaskara at the end. They also have a conversion ceremony. They also formed an apex body to regulate the rules, certain things. And this is something, of course, we may not be able to do that, but maybe we can do that with some decentralization. Then there was a formal religious education that was provided, and there was also training provided for the priests. And these priests were trained, the teachers, not just to perform the ceremonies, but also to give talks on the theology and the philosophy, and to explain the significance of the rituals, ethics, etc. They also had set up a university of Indonesian Hinduism, and in that university, they also have courses beyond religious studies, also on ecobiology and civil engineering, which is to do with the traditional irrigation in Bali. So what we can actually learn from them is that we can come up with, think of something with the ritual aspects and coming up with some common basis here. Impediments, what we have here, the first and foremost is that with the case of Balinese, it was a do or die situation, which is not the case with us. And most of us even don't even realize that we are under a siege, so that is a problem. And moksha dharma, as I discussed, that though we have the four pursuits, dharma, artha, kama, moksha, but all that we discuss about is moksha and moksha alone. That's partly because since the time of Buddha, uh, the focus has been that the religion, when you think of religion, the Buddhist doctrines came up, then came the others, of course, the six philosophies were also there. Then came the Vaishnavism, Shaivism, Shaktism. And these are, if you look at it, their text, the tenets, their philosophy, etc., are all to do with the moksha part. They are not to do with the artha and the kama. We also had the dharma shastras, the dharma sutras, and the smritis. We also had the artha shastras, which were dealing with that, but we gradually lost them because of conquest or because of other reasons. But we have lost them, and the things are that presently, when we think of a Hindu text, we can only think of these texts. We don't think of Arthashastra, Chana Kautilya's Arthashastra, as a Hindu text or a religious text. This is one thing, that another kind of the impression that has been created, that Hinduism is equal to the moksha dharma. Temples, we have already discussed. The other part is a pluralism, because of course pluralism was also a problem with Balinese, but ours is a little more different because we have a long history, tradition of different sects, and of course of different philosophies. So these problems are there, but let that be. So coming up with the details of the reformulation and restructuring, we will focus primarily on the process and product here. We are not going to discuss into anything else. The place and people we can leave aside, because that is not so important here for the time being. So we can get into the process and the product. So we can just move on a couple of slides, and we see that we can move on to the next as well. And yes, so the process and product here, the reformulation, the restructuring are discussed. The reformulation is about the theory, and restructuring is about uh, the practices. So the common basis, the integral humanism and the civilization narrative. Restructuring is about the collective rituals, like the Balinese have done. We need to come up with something like that. We need to also have a training program, not only for the acharyas, but also for the general Hindus as well, so that they have a proper a formal education, and also certain programs, cultural and other events in the temples. So let's focus on the common basis here. We can just remove that as well. We can just move on. Yes, to the common basis. Here, Unlike Balinese, we cannot just restrict ourselves to the metaphysics. Metaphysics is fine, but we need to, because since Balinese did not have much of a philosophical tradition in the last few hundred years, unlike us. So, but we do have, and we do have so many paramparas, so many sects. We need to come up with something more. One. Second thing is that unlike the Balinese, we are deeply colonized. If you look at the definition of mythology by Joseph Campbell, that mythology is something of what we call someone else's religion. This definition doesn't apply to us, because Hindus, if you look at it, Hindus talk about Hindu mythology. Very few Hindu would even think of there is something like a Christian mythology or an Islam mythology or a biblical mythology. So we have internalized, we are so colonized even now that we tend to look at our own religion through the lenses of the colonialist. So because of that also, we need to expand. We cannot just keep it to the metaphysics part. We need to bring in some other areas as well, which is the Tantra and the Sankhya. We have to focus also on the Purusharthas, Gitas, and the festivals and etc. I'll explain that also a little bit more in the next slide. Why we need to focus on the Sankhya as well and not just the metaphysics part. Now, the metaphysics, as we have seen, that it is basically about the Paramatma, Ardhanarishwar, the Jivatma, etc., the karma, just like we have with the Balinese thing. But this is not enough for people to actually believe in that. One. Second thing is that when we have so many schools, like so many schools of Vedanta, the Vaishnavas themselves are around 3-4 schools there, 4 schools, I believe. And then there is also the Advaita schools, and there is also the Shaktadvaita schools. Even we can include the Kashmiri Shaivism also there. So, of course, then the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, etc. there. But so many interpretations of Vedanta, it may look like that it's just these are all works of mere cerebration, just like intellectual speculations, just like any other Western philosophies. We need to explain that no, this is based on some kind of a transcendental experience. And that is the USP of our religion, of Hinduism, that it is not a speculation. It is based on some real life experiences at a higher stage of consciousness. And that needs to be explained properly also. And thus that Vedanta, no matter which we take, but if we take it as both the Advaita and the Upanishads itself, we can, okay, it explains what is real. But the explanation of why we see what the world as it is, that is not so properly and well defined there. That the path of evolution is best discussed in, we can go to the next slide again. Yes, thank you. So we can get into this, that part is again explained in the Tantra and the Sankhya. With the Sankhya, it has the 25 elements, the 25 tattvas. The Tantra has the other 11 added to that. So that makes that 36 tattva. These things are very important because they are also explaining certain other aspects of the rituals, like Panchopachara, what we're doing with the Tanmatras, etc. And from there, we need to also come up that there is a way to again go back to that state of reality, to experience that reality. So there is a need to combine. We cannot just keep it to metaphysics alone. We need to also bring in the other aspects. And we need to also explain how these things are. So if on the right side, if you look at the salient features of integral humanism. By the way, integral humanism has largely inspired, the term integral is inspired by Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga here. So it takes into the common basis, of course, that is there, and also combines the classical Hinduism with the folk Hinduism. I won't get into the part of what is folk Hinduism, but basically we can say the pagan traditions that have existed in different parts of the country, which have not properly yet Sanskritized. And that which is the Sanskritized part is the classical Hinduism, where you have some written literature on the philosophy and the practices. So that we need to link them as well. We need to offer the 4 Purusharthas, because people, it has to be the religion should be appealing to all kinds of people. and also to come up with the Pancharinas thing. These last 2 points I have explained in the next slide in detail further, which is that what is happening presently is this is basically how we evolve through lives. That at the very beginning, in the very beginning of the human bonds, you'd find there is a predominance of the tamas, and slowly the rajas expands. It expands, and then it reaches a certain peak where the desires are the most. And of course, when the desires increase, we also run after those desires to fulfill these desires. And because we are able to fulfill these desires, slowly they also come down. It's not that there is no end. We see the case of Yayati, and I think Yayati and Kuru, where Yayati went on with his youth. He spent 1,000 years, then came back and said, I have had enough. So if there is a time, there comes a time when we say that there is enough. It's enough. So that desire thing also drops, and desire thing drops. It's again a part of the natural law. The rajas also drops, and the sattva expands. Now it is only on the right side that what we understand today's Hinduism as the moksha dharma, it is primarily meant for this, the right, extreme right, which is a very small minority part, probably around, of course, we can only speculate whether it's 1% or 5%, whatever it is, but it's a very small part of the population. Most of the population are predominantly Rajasic, and some are also Tamasic. We need to bring about this Purusharthas, the Dharma, Artha, Kama. These are the things that need to be put forth before the larger population, not the moksha. And let's not forget, uh, before the printing press came in, much of the moksha dharma, the text, even something like the Bhaja Govindam, the Mahamudgar, Shankaracharyas, they were meant only for the monks. They were not meant for the householders. So when we put this, it creates a problem. Now that also brings us to a little bit of a understanding of a dharma. Dharma, we know that it has many meanings. One is as a rita, the way of things. Like this is a rita, that there is an increase of rajas, there is also a decline of rajas. This is also a rita, this is the way of things. Another is that the water flows from high to low. That is also a rita kind of say. The other dharma is the kartavya, the obligations, the duties. So we have the varnashrama dharma, we have the samanya dharma, which are this. The other dharma is the dharma mata, the religions that we talk about, whether it's Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, whether, of course, some people say that we should not be considering the others as dharma, but let's leave that aside. We can discuss that some other day. But there is also a fourth thing, which we say that abhudhaya nishreza, that actually helps us to progress further. Now, that progress is depending on the person where he stands. Suppose one is standing at the extreme left. For that person, even moving us little bit to the right itself, something, any teaching, anything that is conducive, any tenet that is conducive for him to move a little bit to the right, that is dharma. Now, if we want to put the moksha part, which is meant for the small, minuscule minority of the population, if you want to teach these things to person on the extreme left or somewhere in the middle, that is not going to help him out. So then that case, this is not dharma at all. It becomes a kind of an apadharma, we can say. That becomes tamasic for this person, because that person who is more tamasic, he needs to be made more rajasic. A person who is more, till he reaches the peak, he needs to be made more rajasic, and then slowly as it comes in, we can just try to cultivate the sattva in that. So this is the entire basis, that we need to bring about that customization. So most of the majority of the people, we need to bring in the dharma, artha, kama. We need to put that before them, and that is how the Hinduism needs to be reformulated. Let's bring this part, bring the pancharina. We have the rishirin, the devrin, the pitrin, the bhurin, the nirin. Let's bring these things more to the people so that they develop a sense of the community, that we have to do something for the community, for the earth, for the nation. And of course, the classical and the folk, these things, and we need to develop the classical and the folk. Here is, we need to develop the devotion more. Today, there is, I would say, an overdose of Advaita Vedanta among the population. Let's be very honest, there would have been no Rama Mandir movement, there would have been no Shabarimala movement if all the devotees of Sri Rama and Sri Shabrimala used to be, if they would have believed that, okay, I am not the body, I am the Atma. I'm sorry, that would not have happened. Hinduism would have actually died by now if that thing had been taking place, right? So these are the areas that we need to work on, and that is what I also mean by uh, the the integral humanism. This is where we need to do a lot of the reformulation work, and this is largely an academic word. It is not a pure the basic kind of activism. The activism comes in more with the temple-centric thing, which we can see in the next slide, which is that the temples should become a part of the community. So we need to have more of the vigrahas, which we can work on, which is more non-sectarian in character, and then also coming up with the weekly events so that there are some congregations happening in terms of the collective upasanas. We need to devise those things, yes. Mantras based on the day, like you have Monday, a special like Monday is for the Shiva, Tuesday is for Shri Ganesha, Friday I think is also for Lakshmi, even Thursday also. It depends on the regions as well. So we need to come up with these kind of things, the annual events, the Havans, Kirtans, and also annual events of the temples should not be restricted only to religious, but it can also be something political, like Shivaji's Maharaj's coronation can also be celebrated in temple. Why not? So we can do that. Even the Independence Day can also be celebrated in a temple. So we need to bring in some of the political events as well. Some politically, historically significant events need to be part of the temple calendar as well. Monthly events, yes, and special events. Uh, Again, for the community involvement, we can, if we know someone is suffering, and especially now in this COVID times, we can have some collective prayers for the well-being of the members in the community, especially those who are bedridden, who have been hospitalized, etc. On birthdays, we can have some special programs, anniversaries, etc., and the personal rights. And a very important thing is, like many ashrams are doing it, the temples can also come up with some pilgrims and retreats so that people can also bond with each other better, and various seva projects to reach out to the underprivileged. So, with that, I think this is all that I have to share. I don't have much to add at the moment. So, Srijita, I'll give it over to you.
Thank you so much, Debabrata. So we will open this forum for questions or comments from the audience. As I had told you in the beginning, you can use the chat box or the comment box below the video and write down your questions. We will take them up. Till the time our audience come up with some questions, I wanted to ask a question, Debabrata, if that is okay. Are you able to hear me, Debabrata?
Yes, yes, I can hear.
Okay. So I wanted to put out a question here. So you have brought up the issue of Balinese Hindus and the adjustments they have been able to bring to the way they practice Hinduism. Do you see this trend being replicated in other diaspora? Because Balinese Hindus have a special history. Um, they were the indigenous people there, and they had to face, uh, challenges by Abrahamic faiths and proselytization, the same as we had to face in India. But do you see some of these I would say, strategies that have been apparent in the way the Balinese Hindus have readjusted their social, socio-political, and cultural mode of being. Uh, are those elements observable? Are those trends observable anywhere else among the Hindu diaspora?
Unfortunately, I don't think so. Because what the Balinese did was something nearly impossible. I mean, all the credit goes out to them. Because Balinese Hindus also had a lot of divisions among them in their beliefs and the local traditions, but they wanted to survive, and they wanted to survive with their identity. And this is, and you know what, a major difference between the Hindu Indian diaspora Hindus and the Balinese Hindus is that while our us we are focusing more on the moksha aspect, for them the ancestor worship is far more important. And when we talk about the Pitrine is not supposed to be just about doing some tarpan for the, or just having a progeny, but it is also to let the culture continue over generations. And because they had that kind of a linking with their ancestors, they felt that they must somehow keep this tradition alive for the sake of their ancestors also. For us, somehow that kind of a zeal has not yet developed. That is one. Second thing is that we have, as you said, but as I said earlier also, that we have not yet really, we don't show much of pragmatism when it comes to religion. There is too much of inertia. We are burdened with traditions. uh, Either we belong to some sect, so we cannot go beyond that sect, the sectarian thinking over there. And if we are not so, we don't belong to any sect, probably we think of doing something in terms of politics. Means if we are largely not so much religious, but still we carry a Hindu identity in our hearts, we think of doing things in terms of politics. And wherever this attempt was made, at least not now, as what the reform movements that we discussed in brief with Brahma Samaj and the others, that is, those were also kind of a similar attempts, but they ended up, because they were so radical in their approach, because of that iconoclastic approach, they ended up become sects themselves. So, but in general, if you look at it, I won't say there has been a conscious effort to emulate the Balinese Hindus, and partly maybe because we are not so much aware of their history and what they have done and what they have achieved. But however, at least in the US and maybe in UK, there are some temple communities that have come up, which maybe I would say unconsciously or unwittingly, they are following some, they're treading the Balinese path to some extent. Maybe they haven't come up with a uh, with some books. Though I think the Hindu Temple of Minnesota, the Minnesota community, thanks to Vishal Agarwal, he has written a few books for the children on Hinduism and also on various aspects of Hinduism. The Kwai, the Hindu Himalayan Academy, the Hindu, I think that the Himalayan Academy and Kwai, the Hawaii uh, project, this the institution, they have come up with a book which shows the basic tenets or the common basis of Hinduism, which is also quite popular there in the US. But there has been no concerted effort to actually do something in a very structured fashion. I'm not aware of that. I'm sorry. I don't think so.
Okay, thank you for that. Debabrata, you talked about the roles that were played by um collective organizations, assertions like Brahmo Samaj or Arya Samaj, Pratna Samaj, and the like. So, do you see any such collective organizational assertion coming out in the last 2 decades or so, uh, either in India or outside of India? Are there any such examples where a collection of people have come together? Maybe they have formed institutions outside the legitimate, structures of institution. Maybe they are not constitutional institutions. Maybe they are not backed by the government. or maybe there is a lack of big capital behind them. But are there such congregations in the recent past where people of any dharmic community, not just Hindus, I would also like to consider the dharmic communities of Bauddhas or Jainas or even Sikhs coming together and asserting themselves for the continuity of their practices?
Uh, as far as the Buddhists are concerned, of course, we have seen in Myanmar and in Sri Lanka. In fact, in both the places, especially in Sri Lanka, again, Sri Lanka was also colonized. Sri Lanka also, the Sri Lankan Sinhalese Buddhism had also undergone a change in the last 150 years. And because of which, they're in a far better position politically. Uh, but even Myanmar, we have seen recently the Buddhist monks taking the lead in dealing with their cultural sovereignty and the political sovereignty as well against other forces. But otherwise, and I have recently come across in terms of the temples, just very recently, I'm yet to get the details. In Bengal, there is a small movement coming up where there is an attempt to unify the temples and come up with a temple-centric, the congregation kind of thing. Uh, Outside, I'm not aware of Europe or US with the Hindu diaspora, what is happening. The Caribbeans might be it would be interesting to study the Caribbean Hindus, but I haven't yet done that in detail.
I see. There's a question from the audience on YouTube. RR has asked, to understand Hindu society, one must understand its history, the Hindu epistemology, and even look at how nations like Turkey built their nation. Yeah. How to inculcate this on the Indian polity that's colonized? What would be your response to this?
First thing is, as far as Turkey is concerned, I'm not very sure whether it has, if we think of Turkey building the nation from the times of Kamal Pasha, I think, and there would also be a reversal. They would probably get back to their old, what is that, Ottoman Empire, if I remember correctly. That is the name, right, for the Turkish Empire.
Yes, that's right. Right.
So I think they will again get back to the imperial identity rather than their national identity. There is a very strong current, what I see, and this would happen. But I think the Hindu means to understand. But with the Hindus, the history itself, first of all, when we look at the Indian Hindus, we need to first of all expand our vision in terms of the history. We need to first of all focus on not just Indian history but also the entire Hindu sphere across Asia, which it includes Southeast Asia, the Hindu empires over there, as well as Hindu influence in via Buddhist in China, and of course a direct influence on Japan. That history, first of all, we need to come up with that. With Hindu epistemology, I don't know how far, I haven't really worked on that, but this itself, that creates a little bit of problem. I believe that, just like I said with the Turkey, it can get into the the imperial, from the national to the uh, imperial aspect. We can also probably get more into that, but I think that here comes the pagan tradition of, that attachment to the land, the sacred geography. It's more than the epistemology. I would say is the history and the sense of sacred geography. Uh, by history, I also include the social history. That have these two areas can actually be blended together to develop the idea of the Indian nation. And that is how, in fact, the Indian nationhood has actually been born. But That's how we can look at it. For example, if you look at it, how means it's just I'm sharing my thoughts on how this the Indian nation, the making of Indian nation is basically a collection of many things. One is the finding a very similar social system across the entire length and breadth of the country. So even when someone moved out of a kingdom, it was there was never a cultural shock, because the life at a village level or even at an urban level, that was more or less the same, and that was made possible only because of the social structure that was developed over the ages. That is there. And the second thing is the sacred geography, because people, even though uh, not many moved too much outside, many might have probably lived within a radius of 100 kilometers or so the entire life, but at least through the text, when you read about the various pilgrim centers, at least that also gave them a sense of the nation, that they are a part of that nation. So these two are very important. And of course, the third thing has been the migration of people. And the gotras is also something that we often underestimate or we underutilize. Like, we focus too much on the jati and less on the gotra. But if you look at the at our rituals, when during a puja a person is needs to mention his gotra, not his jati. And that gotra we share, in irrespective of jati, we can share a very similar gotra. Irrespective of jati and irrespective of regions, we can share a very similar gotra. Someone who is of the uh, Modgal Gotra, we know that probably he might have come in Bengal also. Someone from Modgal Gotra might have come from Karnataka, from there in the south. So that way, that these things we need to work on. And even the spiritual, the sect, the spiritual sect, someone was born here at one part of the country, his sect, the headquarters of his sect might belong to the extreme other end of the country geographically. So that also brings in a sense of that the sacred geography that I was talking about. So this the sacred geography, the social system, the lineages in terms of gotras, the migrations, all these things, we need to put that in proper perspective so that we can develop a sense of nationhood. It's not that difficult. We just need to put it in a proper way. We need to structure it in a proper way.
Okay, so Gotra can be a very important cultural unifier, and you have also
In fact,
mentioned.
not only for a cultural unifier, it can also be used against the Aryan invasion theory. Because if you look at it, any and not only Aryan invasion or Aryan migration, because a race, if there is a race coming in from outside, and they feel themselves superior to the others who are the local inhabitants, why would they share their lineage with others? Why would they pass on their gotras to others? Why would they let others also access to their gotras, their identities, ancestral identities?
Right, there's some food for thought for us, for our audience. Um, Another thing that I was going to mention here, you have talked about the importance of sacred geography, and for the last almost 2 years, we have seen that due to the coronavirus pandemic, the circuits in which our pilgrimages happen have been almost more or less closed, practically closed, and do you feel that that has caused a sort of disruption in the process of our cultural unification, or a pan-Hindu consciousness, pan-Indic consciousness?
2 years is a very short period, I believe, uh, to bring about that kind of a change. But rather, I think this is also this. I think once this lockdowns and this the fear of the corona subsides, we are going to bounce back. I believe there would be an increase in tourism. There would be a spurt. in visits to all these pilgrimages, because I'm sure many people are waiting because they have lost 1 year, 2 year. They would not like to miss it a third time, because people have their plans to meet to visit different pilgrimage places. So probably we can see a much a rise in their numbers than usual in the coming years, if things go correct in the next year.
Right. Uh, Another question I had in mind. So we have our neighboring country, Nepal, which has been ruled by a monarchy until recently, and it has been a Hindu nation. It has a Hindu majority, and until very recently, it was described as a Hindu nation. It was to describe itself as a Hindu nation. So it also shares the sacred geography of our Indian subcontinent. So, are there any lessons or any models that can be emulated from the experience of Nepal, from its polity as well as its cultural dynamics?
I think Nepal, if you look at it, is just if Nepal had means as a region, its experiences. Of course, it has the Hindu society of Nepal uh, uh, go through the same ills that we have. But in terms of polity, the evangelical activities have also increased. So I'm still not really. I would not like to put that in that format that we have really. It's the chapter isn't closed yet. That you can say something that we can actually learn something. But we need to keep an eye on the developments and see what we can, if there are some inputs to give. I honestly speaking, I have not really got much into the detail of Nepali politics, just the basic trends. But those trends, I think, many things can get reversed. Also, I think there is yeah, I think there is also a question. I believe that should Hinduism
Right,
become a proselytizing religion?
right,
Yeah.
and that comes quite naturally after the mention of proselytizing religions being a threat to
Yes.
the Hindu culture and civilization all over the world.
Yes, the
So,
answer is a definite yes, and a very emphatic yes. For another a very metaphysical reason, I would say. See, when we look at Hinduism, when we say it's a Sanatana Dharma, the Sanatana Dharma is something that is perennial. Perennial because it contains some transcendental truths. Like, for example, a person is born, grows, dies, and then he is born again. And this is not a speculation. This is based on a transcendental experience. So no matter what, no matter to which religion someone belongs to, he still is following some of the basic Sanatana rules. The only thing is, it is the onus is on us to actually help that person to develop further. So, since we know that that person might believe that he has only one life, and after that there is that everlasting hell or heaven, whatever it is, but we know that that is not the case. At least that is not what our rishis discovered. So it is just like Maharshi Dayanand said, that Kinmanta Vishwamaryam, that focus is already there. That we need to make the people noble, but we need to. It is actually a responsibility to let people move towards the right path, something that is a progressive again in terms of what we discussed earlier, moving from a tamas gradually to the rajas, and from the rajas gradually to the tamas. And in fact, today we see that again, coming back to the problem, like when we do that as an apadharma, the problem is that we force people actually to be born outside our community because of some of the problems. So once we rectify our own things, we need to take it forward to people of other communities, other regions as well. Yes, very much.
thank you for that. Um, Today is 22nd of May, and it so happens that it is the birthday of Raja Ram Mohan Rai. You have mentioned the Atyo Shobha Brahmo Samaj, and so my next question would be the impetuses and that brought about these movements when they came in the 19th century, do you think that those same impetuses have somehow been misinterpreted or have been muddied in our understanding of their history, and as a result, we need to look at some specific references or sources so that we can uh, enhance our understanding of these and maybe learn the lessons uh, that are inherent in these experiences, experiences of those movements and uh, organizations for our times. Can you mention some of these resources for our audience?
I did not understand your question correctly. Are you saying that the impetuses that were there for Ram Mohan or Maharshi to come out with the reformations, are you saying that whether we are in a position to understand and appreciate those impetuses, or are you saying that whether these impetuses are still there present now? That is not very clear to me.
So, to put in other words, the impetuses that brought about the movements of Raja Ram Mohan or Mahorshi Dayananda um, are, the forces which shaped our history in a certain manner, and there were definite, necessities felt by people like Ram Mohan to reorganize, restructure, and repackage our religion and our civilizational culture in a way. So we are feeling the same sort of needs at this time and age. But when we look back at those experiences of Ram Mohan or Dayananda, uh, we have seen that there is a sort of misunderstanding in our attempts to learn the history of those experiences. Can we look at some specific resources, some texts, which will help us enhance our understanding of those experiences? That's what I'm trying to do.
Of their experiences.
That's right.
Okay. Yes, I think we need to take a fresh, unbiased look at our social history, because there is a tendency to somehow negate the negativities that existed, the ills that existed in the society at that point of time. So until and unless we are honest enough to judge and appraise those problems, we are not going to be in a position to judge them as well correctly. And I would like to take this forward to something else. Like, why are we still feeling that impetus? If you look at it, because we took a shortcut. What Ram Mohan and Maharshi did was they were not willing to compromise. They actually wanted to get to the root of the problem, and they wanted to bring about some change. Unfortunately, beyond a certain point, by 1880s, 90s, or when Hindus became more politicized, we thought we moved on to the political problem without taking cognizance of the fact that uh, the Hindu society needs to be changed somehow. A lot of changes need to be done within the Hindu society so that we can face the political challenges in the future. Because if you look at it, the British rule was more like a civil society kind of thing. It created a civil society, unlike with the Islamic period, where a rebellion against any kind of a revolt would have been an armed revolt. We could not have thought during the Muslim period. We could not have thought of something like the Dandi March, right? So we had thought of that. Okay, this politics, this kind of a political movement can actually bring about some changes. We can get our independence, etc. Forgetting the fact that even if we get the independence, or forgetting the rather, we also forget the past, the Muslim past, very quickly during that period. And since the British were always a very few in numbers, unlike unlike the Muslims at that point of time, which was almost a one third, at least a good chunk of the population. So we did not bother to think that okay, even if the British go, is the Hindu society strong enough, cohesive enough to deal with the Islamic problem again? this is a question that we somehow put it under the carpet, under this thing. So this, and if we did not do that, this impetus would not have existed at this point of time. We would have continued with some kind of a reformulation then itself, 1890s, 1900s. That was the time then we should have, but then probably that we could not do was also because of a lot of inertia within the Hindu society. So we could not do that, but uh, this needs to be done somehow, and this needs to be done quickly. And coming back to that question, those impetus, that the social history is something that we need to look at it in a very dispassionate manner without investing our emotions in it. And then only can we judge them correctly.
Any specific references where people can look for such a clarified account of those histories?
I think more than one has to read between the lines in those books to understand what is going on. And of course, Western accounts during that period is important. Regional literature is something very important to understand the literature, and any even those the kind of changes that we spoke of, the disruptive changes, and what was the reaction of the society. There are some always, there would be at least studying that movement thing, like in Tamil Nadu there was a movement, in Maharashtra there was a social movement. We need to study those movements also. That would also help us to understand what were the impetus for Maharshi, for Ram Mohan, to bring about that changes what they did.
Okay. So there's a comment and a follow-up question by RR in the comment sections. Um he says that he has taken up his cue from our discussion of pilgrimage sites all across the Indian subcontinent, and he points out that there are such sites in the present-day nation states of Pakistan and Bangladesh as well. So the question is, the Nehruvian polity deliberately separated the Hindus from crossing the borders and going to these pilgrimage sites. So how do we make Hindutva and Hindu nationhood stronger by going to, or rather using the temple space? And Ramakrishna Mission has shown some path. ISKCON has done some work in this regard. How do we also take into account that those pilgrimage sites which are out of bounds in a manner of speaking for a majority of Hindus, uh, how can those be accessed also?
um, One thing is that when it comes to religious sites, again, we should focus not just in Bangladesh, Pakistan, we should also focus on the Southeast Asia. We need to expand further. Angkor Wat, for example, or even that the famous temple that has been again uh, gone live in Indonesia. I don't remember, I can't recollect the name now offhand, but those things are very important. And but then the memory of these sites can only be when we have a proper ethno-religious education. That's why we are coming back to that we need to have a proper education where that history is also taught. Just a study of the religious text itself is not enough to bring about a Hindu identity or Hindu mobilization and consolidation, for example.
You mean just the
So
reading of Moksha Shastra texts?
yes, not only Moksha Shastra, even Artha Shastra also. Just studying the Artha Shastra text may not make you a Hindu. You probably start applying those skills, those techniques, those principles in your office politics as well. Who knows, right? So the thing is that the collective identity is very important. That collective identity comes from a sense of history. It doesn't come from studying theology.
So community is the point of emphasis rather than the individual in this
Right.
case.
Right.
Uh,
So temples, yes, temple spaces very much important, but along with that, the temples should themselves be used as the centers for such learning. That is important.
which they were at a point of time, and we have to try and see how we can bring that up again.
Yes,
Uh,
actually.
so we'll take a final question from the audience. Prithvi C asks, why do Hindus generally do not operate collectively? So here the question is about why does that phenomenon comes across as it is, that there is no collective endeavor to operate in the cultural or political sphere, unlike the other uh, communities.
Yes, that also brings us back to what we just mentioned just now, and we have also discussed in the presentation. We don't have a collective identity. That kind of a collective identity is not taught properly. A Muslim or a Christian, they know their tenets well, they know their history well. We know neither. We have discussed that also, that average Hindu knows nothing about his own religion, knows nothing of the other religion, and also knows nothing about his history. So till this, that is the crux of the problem, and that is the root. We need to actually eliminate. If you have to go to that route, we need to come up with some text there, and also come up with a mechanism to reach out to people, so that they can start reading that text, and then only that identity will develop. And then also we need that text is just one part, and then the congregation is the other. We have these two. We have a collective congregation with some collective ceremonies, which we can do both collectively as well as individually, if we are not in a position to go to the temple for some reason there. And the books and a proper narrative, you can say the great Hindu narrative, that needs to be there. Without these two, it's just whatever we're doing is just a patchwork, nothing else. Every time we'll find some leader who will redeem us, but that is only going to be temporary. Will again see us back to the same old position.
Thank you for that, Debabrata. And with that, we would like to thank the audience for joining us in this very important lecture presentation and the subsequent Q&A conversation. I would say that this was a very, very enlightening and important talk. I'm sure that you have enjoyed it as much as I have done. Thank you very much.
I would
Shubham.
also like to thank everyone, and my apologies because of the signal, the bandwidth problem. We could not have the video here, but that's fine. I think probably sometime next time, probably things would be better.
Sure,
Thank you so
Debabrata.
much. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
everyone, for joining in, and thank you, Sridhar, for giving me that opportunity, and Shivji, everyone. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.